Hi, I'm Leon Lovelace, and this is Unstoppable Force. Okay, I got a news story for you, and it's from MotherJones.com. It's about how lead is actually the leading cause for violence in the United States and across the world. Okay, the Young Turks did this a video in this article about 5 years ago, and it was pretty damn good pretty damn good video. So I read this article a few years ago, and I was like, wow, that's pretty good. But you still kind of put on the back burner naturally because just society doesn't really want to admit that lead poisoning is what's actually the leading cause of violent crime here in the U.S. So it's easy to actually put on the back burner because the Young Turks did a video on it, but then no other mainstream media organization did a video on it. And just through the cycle of the years, and whenever the news does talk about violent crime and maybe trying to get it to decline so the public is actually healthier for it, they never ever talk about lead poisoning. Okay, this article starts out with about how Rudy Giuliani ran for mayor in New York City in '93, and he campaigned on being tough on crime, and that's how he won. And then he actually enacted those tough on crime policies. And then it says in '96, the New York Times reported that crime had plunged for the third straight year, the sharpest drop since the end of Prohibition. Since '93, rape rates had dropped 17%, assault 27%, robbery 42%, and murder an astonishing 49%. Giuliani was on his way to become America's mayor, and Bratton was on the cover of Time. It was a remarkable public policy victory. But then it goes on about how political scientists said that demographic bulge of young men would actually raise the rates of crime, but that didn't happen. Then it says by 2010, violent crime rates in New York City have plunged 75% from their peak in the early 90s. But it says that the crime rates dropping wasn't because of Giuliani's tough on crime policies, because violent crime peaked in 1990, and then when they took office, it already dropped by 12%. So of course they had nothing to do with that. Then it says, second and far more puzzling, it's not just New York that has seen a big drop in crime. In city after city, violent crime peaked in the early 90s, then began a steady and spectacular decline. Washington, D.C. didn't have either Giuliani or Bratton, but its violent crime rate has dropped 58% since its peak. Dallas has fallen 70%, Newark 74%, Los Angeles 78%. So I think I'm also going to add that it's likely that the mayors of those cities didn't implement tough on crime policies, because that would also make it even more relevant that the tough on crime policies isn't what dropped the violent crime rates in those cities. Then the author also talks about how a lot of different people and different like criminologists and other people that study this stuff, a lot of people had just one theory of why the crime dropped. Some was about prison expansion, some was about guns and gun control, on family, race, parole and probation, on the raw number of police officers that are actually working in a certain area. Even one person suggested that because of Roe vs. Wade, where legalized abortion actually led to fewer unwanted babies, so there were fewer violent young men. But it does talk about how it's hard to actually prove that all those situations and all those predictions are actually the cause or the effect of an increase or a decrease in violent crime. But I'll start right here. But statistician and conservative commentator Jim Manzi, in his recent book Uncontrolled Econometrics, econometrics consistently fails to explain most of the variation in crime rates. After reviewing 122 known field tests, Mainsey found that only 20% demonstrated positive results for specific crime-fighting strategies, and none of these positive results were replicated in the follow-up studies. So since it couldn't be replicated, you couldn't prove that any of those reasons were because of a drop in crime. Well, here's a good spot. Experts often suggest that crime resembles an epidemic, but what kind? Carl Smith, a professor of public economics and government at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has a good rule of thumb for categorizing epidemics. If it spreads along the lines of communication, he says it causes inflammation. Think Bieber fever. If it travels along major transportation routes, that causes microbial. Think influenza. If it spreads out like a fan, that causes an insect. Think malaria. But if it's everywhere all at once, as both the rise of crime in the 60s and 70s and the fall of crime in the 90s seems to be, the cause is a molecule. And that molecule is lead. Wow, because this is old. I didn't really catch this at first, but in 94, like just when Giuliani was still in office, implementing his tough on crime legislation, Rick Niven was a consultant working for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on the costs and benefits of removing lead paint from old houses. This has been a topic of intense study because the growing body of research linking lead exposure in small children with a whole raft of complications later in life, including lower IQ, hyperactivity, behavioral problems, and learning disabilities. So I'll skip down a little bit. Maybe reducing lead exposure had an effect on violent crime too. Alright, so the biggest I'm going to skip a line or a sentence. The biggest source of lead in the post-war era, it turns out, wasn't paint, it was leaded gasoline. If you chart the rise and fall of atmospheric lead caused by the rise and fall of leaded gasoline consumption, you get a pretty simple upside down U. Lead emissions from tailpipes rose steadily from the early 40s through the early 70s, nearly quadrupling over that period. Then as unleaded gasoline began to replace leaded gasoline, emissions plummeted. Intriguingly, violent crime rates followed that same upside-down U pattern. The only thing different was the time period. Crime rates rose dramatically in the 60s through the 80s, then began dropping steadily starting in the early 90s. The two curves look eerily identical, but were offset by about 20 years. So I'm going to try to find those graphs, because this article doesn't have those, but it has other graphs in it. But Niven's paper is almost completely ignored because I'm going to skip quite a bit. And it's because he's an economist, not a criminologist, and his paper is published in Environmental Research, not a journal with big readership in the criminology community. Then, more importantly, one single correlation between two curves doesn't automatically mean it's the cause of something. So he didn't prove that it caused it. Other studies had to prove that lead caused the violent crime. And then the article talks about how another woman, Jessica Woolpack-Reyes, she was studying lead levels and if that caused any behavior problems with people. So she wanted to find out whether lead exposure caused increases in crime. So what she wanted to do was check out how each state implemented any of the stringent EPA rules for car emissions to see if certain states had higher levels of leaded emissions in their atmosphere, would they have higher rates than states that have lower emissions levels. Yeah, because it says right there, introduction of the catalytic converter combined with increasingly stringent EPA rules steadily reduced the amount of leaded gasoline used in America. But Reyes discovered that this reduction wasn't uniform. In fact, use of leaded gasoline varied widely among states. This gave Reyes the opening she needed. If childhood lead exposure really did produce criminal behavior in adults, you'd expect that in states where consumption of leaded gasoline declined slowly, crime would decline slowly too. Conversely, in states where it declined quickly, crime would decline quickly. And that's exactly what she found. And then it goes on about how Niven, the first author, he wanted to check about the the levels and the crime levels from different countries around the world, because it could be happening in the U.S., but if it's not doing the same thing in Canada, Mexico, France, any other nation, then it wouldn't be true. But if it does follow the same trends in other nations, then you can say it's getting close to being a fact. Because it says, but what are the odds of that same something happening at several different times in several different countries? NAMA collected lead data and crime data for Australia and found a close match. Ditto for Canada and Great Britain and Finland and France and Italy, New Zealand and West Germany. Every time the two curves fit each other astonishingly well. When I spoke to Nevin about this, I asked him if he had ever found a country that didn't fit the theory. No, he replied, not one. Then it also talks about how Howard Melk published a paper with demographer Sami Zaran on the correlation of lead and crime at the city level. They studied 6 U.S. cities that had both good crime data and good lead data going back to the 50s. They found a good fit in every single one. In fact, Melk had even studied lead concentrations at the neighborhood level in New Orleans and shared his maps with the local police. When they overlaid them with crime maps, he told me, they realized they match up. Then it goes down a little bit. Put this all together, you have an astonishing body of evidence. We now studies at the international level, the national level, the state level, the city level, and even the individual level. Groups of children have been followed from the womb to adulthood. Higher childhood blood levels are consistently associated with higher adult arrest rates for violent crimes. All of these studies tell the same story. Gasoline lead is responsible for a good share of the rise and fall of violent crime over the past half century. It goes on some more. I don't think I'm going to cover it because it's just a ton of information. And then The Guardian also has an article, and they talk about pretty much the same thing. That for the areas where there was a lot of lead in it, that's where there's a lot of crime. When there's not that much lead in the area, and there's not that much crime. But it does go on about how pretty much nobody talks about it because the politicians or the police force doesn't really get a big benefit for saying, hey, the lead levels in our environment is actually what's driving violent crime. So it's actually not the police or any certain political policies that are actually going to fix it, but actually cleaning up the lead and getting rid of lead out of our environments, what's going to actually make the public a more safe place and produce more healthy citizens. So that's one reason. Another reason is that, especially for the city level, they're going to have to actually spend money. But yeah, the cities are going to have to actually spend money on cleaning up the environment, cleaning up our soils. And you can even see it that they're not really doing this, because in Flint, Michigan, the city council's there, or the city council's not really pushing to get the lead out the water and clean up the lead pipes, really, because that's what it is for them. It's also the infrastructure too. And then here in Wilmington, we got Gen X in the water, and there's 3,000 other communities that have lead levels just as high as Michigan or higher. And you're not really seeing any news articles about how all these city officials and the mayors really prosecuting all these companies for polluting our environment and really devastating or really having a potential to devastate the health of the community. So we really need to replace a lot of these corrupt guys, and we really need a political revolution so we can actually prosecute people that are actually harming masses of people, and not just having all these politicians looking at just prosecuting people for just all the small crime and all this drug use bullshit. But I think that's about it for this one. But also, I've been doing this new show for about a year and like four months or so. So I actually need to take a break, take a small vacation. Probably only be like a week or so, but I'm gonna need to do that soon. Just recharge my batteries a little bit. Also work on some other things because this isn't pulling in any money for me right now. So I'm actually gonna also work on stuff that bring in a few bucks in my pocket too. Of course, I got my normal job too, so I'm gonna still do that. I actually don't think I'm gonna need to do a video on criticizing Bernie Sanders for pushing this Russiagate bullshit, because this is just total and utter fucking fabrication. And I think the only reason why he was doing this bullshit is to try to pull in some of those Hill bots and try to get them to vote for him in 2020. But it's not fucking worth it, because all it's doing is just propping up some of the fucking lies that the establishment wants to push, because they don't want to admit that they're fucking criminals and overthrowing democracy in front of every fucking body. And it's also showing you that Bernie's not a revolutionary. So if you want a revolution and revolutionize our political and our economic system and even our social system too, he's not the answer for that. So you can vote for him because he's like the most progressive senator in the Senate, and he's more progressive than probably most any of your representatives that are in office now or running now. But he's still is gonna create problems when it comes to actually holding everyone accountable. And he also did some shitty stuff, like not even helping out Tim Canova when he was running against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, especially since she actually cheated him out of winning the Democratic nomination. So for him to not back up Tim Canova and say, hey, people need to check out him because he's actually trying to represent people and not just fucking corporations. So yeah, I like him, but we still have to push for a revolution. And we're going to have to push Bernie to go even more to the left and quit propping up some of these fucking lies that the establishment wants them to prop up. Then I'm probably going to have to bash Cenk and the Young Turks when I get back to. But you guys have to wait for that.